表現というかですね、グラフィックとかサウンドはこの20年ですごく進化はしましたけど、そこで描かれているものってほとんど20年前から変わってないですね。ここをやっぱりなんとかしたいと思ってます。要は悪いやつを倒しに行くというか、そこに、文化とか民族性とかそういうものはほとんど描かれないですよね。でそれは僕らの問題でもあると思うので、そこを含めて、これからもっとこう、進んだ
What's ironic about our retrospective series here is Hideo Kojima presented a similar series-length overview to GDC during his first ever keynote there in 2009. But then he also spoke of the future for MGS. Little did anyone realize at the time, the GDC 2009 presentation was laying the foundation for what would become the final run of Kojima-directed Metal Gear games. The talk would also outline the philosophy Kojima would take with him to Sony and use for Death Stranding. In the hour-long talk, Kojima used the extended metaphor of clearing a seemingly impossible obstacle to represent the universal challenges of game creation, saying that impossibility at the end of the day is just a stereotype. Kojima identified as the ground or foundation, the hardware, and wider technological environment. The question Kojima posed was how to get Snake across the other side, how to make the so-called impossible game idea possible. The ground of technology for Kojima is always rising, making it easier to do today what we couldn't do yesterday. However, his presentation's underlying point was that technology isn't enough, nor is software, which Kojima likened to a climbable box. It can get you closer to your goal, but ultimately, you'll need a ladder. The ladder Kojima called game design. While Japan's culture of game creators still used what Kojima termed designer-driven techniques, in the address Kojima pointed out that as of 2009, a recent trend in Western games was towards so-called technology-based design. For the next Metal Gear Solid series, Kojima ended by saying, the Eastern and Western methods would be combined to form a designer by way of technology-driven design. In this final episode of the technical evolution of MGS, we'll discuss how 2010's Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, 2014's Ground Zeroes, and 2015's The Phantom Pain constitute a grand formal experiment in what today we might call an extended universe. As I'm about to explain, the fifth and final Metal Gear Solid was not one discrete release, but 3. After looking at this experiment, the Walkman trilogy, and how it depended on equally innovative technical and conceptual design, we'll take a deep but hardly comprehensive dive into Kojima Productions' crowning achievement. Developed by the same team as MGS4, Peace Walker reflected Kojima's view of the PSP as a spiritual successor to the Sony Walkman.
I'll be giving you commands and advice through this channel. Keep your headphones on at all times and pay attention. Also, make sure no one else can listen in. Snake.
Kojima had been producing MGS titles for the platform since the PSP's launch back in 2006. But unlike those sideshow games like MGS Portable Ops and both Metal Gear Acids, Peace Walker was a mainline entry.
Get in the AI pod, otherwise it'll reactivate.
Notes.
But more than that, Peace Walker would try to lift the boundary entirely between handhelds and home console games. Building off the replayability and war economy systems of MGS4, Peace Walker directly followed the events of MGS3. Like the rest of MGS5, Peace Walker detailed how the original Snake went from lowly CIA field officer in the 1960s to upper management over his own private military company, or PMC, and in the process, how he turned from hero to villain. One of the reasons Kojima took on directing the game personally, he told Japanese magazine Dengeki in 2009, was, quote, generational differences. Quote, I set the game in South America and created a story with themes about nuclear deterrence and the Cold War. It looked as if it might be very confusing to the young people and my excellent staff, so in the end I finally said, I'll do it, I'll direct the game, end quote. Hideo Kojima told IGN in 2009, for the next Metal Gear or the next new series that Kojima Productions is going to create, we wanted to go one step ahead. Therefore, we need to actually restructure the engines, the tools, and things like that. The process is taking 1 to 2 years. However, within that time frame, we thought, we can't just wait. Within that time frame, we could do a PSP version. End quote. Peace Walker from the ground up was envisioned as, quote, an MGS5 class game. Gamezine.co.uk, 2009. In fact, according to Kotaku in 2010, during the planning stages, Peace Walker was named Metal Gear Solid 5. This is why I call this the Walkman trilogy. Peace Walker simply can't be separated from the question of MGS5. In 2009, Kojima would refer to Peace Walker as the MGS5 inside me.
I'm Walkman. I'm White Man. I'm Walkman. W と M で Walkman。W&M 世界的ニューアクション Walkman ソニー。
If past console MGS games had formerly treated television as the new silver screen,
Snake, have you seen the movie Them?
No.
miniaturization onto the PSP for the series brought this to its logical conclusion. Besides from being the next Walkman, the PSP, as envisioned by Peace Walker, was also the next TV. Even main missions in Peace Walker would be tackled elliptically, punctuated not by act breaks but by the ending of a given episode, in much smaller chunks. The segmented structure facilitated any kind of not only playstyle but lifestyle, much like the original Walkman had. All missions in Peace Walker, unlike any MGS before, could be satisfactorily experienced in bite-sized form, from start to finish, whether on the train to work or just before bed. Peace Walker used fiction and the properties of game design to showcase familiar subjects in a very new platform-centric light. The game's shift to younger audiences coincided with it being set during Kojima's own boyhood era, the 1970s. The simulated bygone era of his youth dovetailed sublimely with the central story and its simulated bygone hero, the boss. Guns of the Patriots had deviated from the series' convention of one mission playing out in one location across one continuous period of time for the entire game. Each act in MGS4 had been like a separate mission of its own in pursuit of a common goal. And during the act break briefings, the player could blow off steam, spending time with their in-game friends, so to speak, watching the briefing, or just running around as the Mark II to uncover unlockables. Peace Walker took this general formula from MGS4 and scaled it up, while importantly reintegrating aspects of something from a much earlier time for the series that we haven't mentioned yet: VR missions. In MGS1, there was not one game mode, but 3. These were main game, briefing, and VR missions. Additionally, you could read a synopsis of previous entries. Clearly, MGS had always used multiple mediums and formats at once. VR missions, and this is key, took place on the submarine that we see Snake riding to Shadow Moses in the briefing. All these different modes and formats you see fit together, even as far back as MGS1. The bonus disc of 300 additional VR missions that came with Metal Gear Solid Integral in 1999, released separately in the States as simply Metal Gear Solid VR missions, added a ton of novel variety modes, like my personal favorite, mystery missions. Peace Walker reinvented the VR mission idea, which had survived all the way into the expansion pack for MGS2 on the Xbox, Metal Gear Solid Substance. On a more rudimentary level, too, Peace Walker went back to the series' roots. Sentry routes came back, as did sneaking behind enemy lines, both outdoors and into bases. Amazingly, elements would reappear for the first time since the MSX era. POWs, again, were spread and concealed throughout the levels. More crucially, an ongoing player rank system was implemented rather than one that only revealed your score at the end of the entire game. This was in part likely because, for the first time, MGS with Peace Walker could go on, theoretically, without end. All three of the Walkman trilogy would further continue MGS4's crusade of developing secret mechanics and systems, albeit in different ways. Peace Walker has a ton of secrets, from extra ops to equipment to even a second ending. But with Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain, secrets extended beyond the software into the underlying design environment in ways that could almost make MGS4 seem positively under-detailed by comparison. And as we'll turn to now, this had to do with the secret weapon devised by Kojima Productions in conjunction with work on Peace Walker. It was a completely standalone in-house development platform, the Fox engine. Back during the Crusades, the flow of language along with trade in the Eastern Mediterranean had fostered the growth of, quote, language as a means of communication between populations speaking vernaculars that are not mutually intelligible, end quote. Encyclopedia Britannica. This language of languages that could enable communication across cultural linguistic gaps is known as a bridge language, or, as it's called in the plot of The Phantom Pain, a lingua franca. If you think about a given piece of hardware, say the PS3, as a different language for the developers compared to the game itself, it makes sense that the process of translating software ideas into hardware performance is kind of like developing a bridge of communication between them, a lingua franca, if you will, a lingua franca of game development. Such a thing would helpfully simplify the entire design and creation process that made developing MGS4 such an arduous task by getting everything in the design environment onto the same technical page. MGS had been using technology to mess with our minds since at least MGS2. An enduring theme would be perception versus reality, legend versus truth. How can two groups see the same world differently enough to go to war over their differences? This was the question Peace Walker posed, Ground Zeroes pondered, and the Phantom Pain attempted to answer. And it would do so through the technology of the Fox engine.
Snake?
The place to begin is the gap dividing digital cameras from human eyesight. To quote Cambridge in Color, with a digital camera, when twice the number of photons hit the sensor, it receives twice the signal. Thus, a linear relationship. Pretty logical, right? That's not how our eyes work. Instead, we perceive twice the light as being only a fraction higher, and increasingly so for higher light intensities. Thus, a non-linear relationship. End quote. It seems for our eyes, 2 plus 2 does not in fact equal 4. This feature of human sight reflects our evolutionary descendants out of Africa. Quote, compared to a camera, we are much more sensitive to changes in dark tones than bright, Without perceiving this broader range of luminance, the typical range in brightness that we encounter outdoors would be too overwhelming." End quote. Gamma is partly a means of encoding or redistributing, quote, tonal levels closer to how our eyes perceive them than the linear digital camera used to capture the image. However, an additional encoding must transpire for displaying the image on your monitor. This is done to, quote, effectively convert a gamma encoded image back into light from the original scene, end quote. And without going any further, this second process of gamma calibration was achieved differently by the Fox engine through use of a different procedure for gamma called linear workflow. Without it, Fox couldn't have achieved its goal of not only photorealism, but so-called physical space rendering and linear space lighting. Kojima Productions used a photography room with a linear capturing image sensor, as well as raw image format processing, to preserve the linear values necessary for the engine's linear gamma workflow. By photographing textures and surface materials hit with light from various angles, material observation proved instrumental in achieving Fox's goal of physically based rendering. A special feature was created called view-dependent roughness. This introduced a visual illusion mathematically. The smaller the angle of observation, the apparently smoother the surface. Lighting, too, would utilize real-world parameters and measurements. Kojima Productions studied real-world lighting and reflection properties, and hired a live-action lighting director, Yoshiharu Nishiyama, to fuse together the combo that MGS as a series had been striving to blend together all along: movies and games, real and digital environments. But captivating visuals that delivered strong emotion represented more of a priority for Kojima Productions than simple photorealism alone. In key respects, Fox would actually deviate from pure realism, much in the vein of how, say, MGS1 had used weapons like the Nikita, Fox Die, or even Metal Gear Rex, all of which derived from exaggerating real-life military projects and gear. As Kojima himself remarked back in 1998, half of MGS1's military stealth technologies were real and the other half were fake. Weapon-wise, 2/3 are real and 1/3 unreal. However, imaginary does not mean from fantasy. MGS is based on reality. End quote. A major non-realistic stylistic signature for MGS-V would be an auto exposure that focused only on lighting, as opposed to lighting and color. A camera lens can't fully distinguish shade from lighting when it comes to deep black and white. The Fox engine was calibrated to adjust for this by ignoring color and completely focusing on brightness, giving it a stable auto exposure system that remained compositionally sound in any situation from one scene to another. Fox's lighting model would also feature translucency, which affected shaders for skin, hair, clothes, and vegetation, allowing them to reflect environmental lights, bringing character models seamlessly into their environment.
Thanks, Fox Engine.
Set mere months after Peace Walker, MGS-V Ground Zeroes established that the V-Class MGS games would play fast and loose with past, present, and future. Both technologically and culturally, Ground Zeroes represented a wormhole in the fabric of space-time that seemed to merge together the dirty wars from the 1970s-era Americas, the post-9/11 global war on terror, and the Dark Ages. Set 9 years after the events of Ground Zeroes, The Phantom Pain also blurred together centuries, as now Venom Snake, in charge of no longer MSF but Diamond Dogs, players were taken to some of the oldest and longest enduring battlefields on Earth, draped under the pretext of the Reagan-era Cold War. Ground Zeroes and The Phantom Pain would both feature groundbreaking opening scenes that truly mess with your head. Ground Zeroes did so with mainly lighting and shadows, which often did not map to any source or did not resemble what they should have. This pioneered by way of the hybrid designer/tech model introduced by Kojima at GDC 2009, a new approach to video game horror. And The Phantom Pain would kick things up a notch, employing a host of half-concealed effects and techniques to express its protagonist's haunted and brain-damaged inner world. Ground Zeroes introduced reflex mode, which switched on a high-speed camera effect that functioned almost like Rockstar Games' bullet time, yet looked and felt like nothing else. Ground Zeroes opened with a declaration of aesthetic independence, using camera work, lighting effects, and dark shadows that only worked universally across every platform thanks to the physically based rendering, linear workflow, and linear diffusion of the Fox engine. The stylistic conceit of ballet-esque blocking for scenes became, in Ground Zeroes, almost like musical choreography. The extended solo camera single-take opening scene culminates in a sophisticated yet subtle arrangement which brings the camera sweeping through a military procession. This single moment required such exact positioning and coordination of all the actors involved, Kojima dedicated an entire day to perfecting it. All that detail and artistry would be lost without the linear lighting, and how it used physically based rendering to make Guantanamo Bay at night dark yet somehow still clearly visible. Linear de-gammaed workflow leads to much more realistic surface shading and nicer color response in the surface, end quote. A random example of how the Fox's linear workflow works in practice is that narrower spotlights on viewing angle produced brighter light. The bottom line for the Fox engine is that it achieved photorealism not only at the end of the development pipeline, but from the beginning and all throughout. Peace Walker had often reused the map across multiple missions, sometimes by changing the time of day. The first 3 MGS games, meanwhile, had all used a fake day-night cycle that relied upon not real time, but your story progress. Thanks to the Fox engine's advanced simulation of a sky, which obviously had to work off its lighting and other aspects, the addition of a day-night cycle to MGS-V convincingly altered the visible environment and lens exposure that it resulted seamlessly over time. And color balance during night in Ground Zeroes was cooler and bluer. But an arsenal of other under-the-hood environmental details existed in Fox 2. If we look here, we can see that the rain has choked this river with mud. MGS-V, the Phantom Pain, would offer huge environments of unbelievable scope, breadth, and beauty. The game would also feature extremely horrifying moments of psychological expressionism where reality and delusions would become impossible to distinguish. Another piece of evidence are the 2 keynote addresses Kojima gave at GDC, 4 years apart. One was during development on Peace Walker, the other Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain. The first address in 2009 laid out Kojima's vision for what the 2013 address would later reveal as the Fox engine. It was all one continuous process of development, release, development, from Peace Walker to Ground Zeroes to the Phantom Pain. And we would see this echoed in the gameplay loop for all three games. Itself a process of development, release, development. In Peace Walker, the more that your so-called mother base grew, the more platforms were constructed around it automatically. In the Phantom Pain, not only could you visit your headquarters in-game, but decide exactly how to build it. This impacted gameplay because each wing of your organization, from R&D to Intel to Medbay, depended in the Phantom Pain, as well as in Peace Walker, on the relative size of their staff and facilities. Both Peace Walker and the Phantom Pain would employ running day-to-day operations at Mother Base remotely. Once new personnel were aboard, either you or the computer had to sort them into a division. How much you did this was up to you, but each division had unique stats and abilities that you'd have to rely on one way or the other, meaning all divisions mattered, not just R&D, the one primarily responsible for creating new weapons. Both games would include not only side ops, but so-called outer ops. Snake dispatched mercs to fight in combat zones the world over. Both games would also feature the series' tradition of climaxing with a tense, high-stakes infiltration and demolition mission in order to destroy the enemy's advanced weapons platform, Metal Gear. They'd also both feature an entire additional post-game chapter and second secret ending. But the Phantom Pain would also introduce eerie, psychologically expressionistic elements like timeline gaps, not to mention the return of Ground Zero's ghostly not shadows, so to speak. In Peace Walker, stages worked almost like Mario worlds, with increasing difficulty the further you got to the end. Missions would rarely center on the entire map but use different parts discreetly, so even though you were returning to a level or levels, it didn't feel like the backtracking from the MSX and PSX eras. You'd see a new part of it or end up using the level in a new way. Ground Zeroes, meanwhile, necessarily introduced the major motifs for MGS5 of a global police state as a stealth game, operating by night or by day in MGS5 has direct gameplay consequences. The game's huge, sprawling open world would gate some of itself off during missions, but within that zone there was still large enough space to utilize hidden intel files, which, if found, would pinpoint your objective exactly. Several missions would make this process of hunting after what the character Skullface calls a needle in a stack of needles a central feature. Apart from refinements and minor advancements like aerial support and drivable vehicles, as well as a few more, the MGS5 games at their core were the mirror image, the phantom if you will, of Peace Walker. What's important is the biggest obstacle that MGS5 overcame was the stereotype of MGS itself. This gameplay-heavy, sophisticated, yet curiously narratively opaque experience couldn't have differed more from MGS4. Even Snake no longer literally resembled himself, but for those who had played Peace Walker, what was clear was the continuity that secretly underlied the trio of games. The Phantom Pain effectively fused together the best aspects from Peace Walker and MGS4, leaving the worst elements of both games to cancel out. Peace Walker's research and development had provided one of the main gameplay impetuses for non-lethal captures. Growing the R&D branch of Snake's outfit, MSF, along with recovering blueprints in the field, were the only way to strengthen your army. But for all the different guns in Peace Walker, they had lacked the detailed differences in handling from Guns of the Patriots. They had lacked the same scale of variety, with less tactical implications, even if there still was a considerable amount for a PSP game. The Phantom Pain fixed all that with its much improved updates to the R&D system and addition of gun customization. It also reworked and polished the controls to become the best that they've ever been for the series. MGS4 Snake's role sat alongside Peace Walker's deep prone stance, and unlike MGS4, there weren't so many hidden control mechanics to intrude upon basic gameplay. One of the most important conceits uniting the Walkman trilogy had to do with a subject rarely tackled head-on by the games industry despite its global audience: culture. The gameplay variety coincided with the diversity of MGS's player base. Peace Walker was a new kind of meaning of the word open world, one that left itself open-ended to accommodate the entire planet, something MGS had somewhat always tried to achieve. FPSs aren't that popular in Japan, so Peace Walker, as well as MGS4, for example, implemented toggleable auto-aim. Costa Rica is obscure to most of the world, so Peace Walker made it the central setting. The international cadre of Snake's private army throughout the Walkman trilogy would often compare cultural notes, reveling in the similarities, cutely quibbling over the minor differences. And in The Phantom Pain, these differences would curdle into full-blown ethnic strife-like conflicts between former family members. Anyone in the world was welcome to join Snake's cause, in all three games, not only as gamers, but as mercenaries that you would recruit around the world. This made up part of the PSP game's approach to artistically expressing the post-Watergate era's dream for world peace in terms understandable for a 21st century generation. A group that the series had been anticipating all along with its prevalent themes about genetics, dynasties, and what to pass on to the future. A big hint that the three games were really one was the three corresponding quotations that would be included by European philosophers. But where culture really got expressed in The Phantom Pain was in terms of its ambiguity. How you saw the events and characters of the game tacitly, likely depended at least in part on your cultural background. In philosophy, what both the Fox engine and MGS-V represented might be compared to the Nietzschean doctrine known as perspectivism. How you see and experience the world, the Walkman trilogy seemed to suggest, is part reflection of your perspective, and in turn, your identity, and in turn, your past. MGS-V would return a long-time tradition of interactive free zoom at any time during cutscenes, but now this Easter egg secret mechanic had a purpose: investigation. This mysterious and experimental game packed its cutscenes with obscure details, a bold new feature that played like some twisted melding together of Silent Hill and Pokemon Snap. It was also necessary to connect with people from different language groups around the world if you wanted to translate all the game's many different signs and snatches of recorded speech. As I mentioned, all three MGS5s illustrated Kojima's interest in the theme of culture, partly by using philosophical aphorisms. Another hint was the late 20th century cultural backdrop, which Kojima lived through himself, and which he saw as an important factor in directing. What's also crucial to remember is that tape was the missing link, so to speak, dividing the eras of analog and digital. Cassette technology brought data writing to home computers and video games for the first time. Tapes made it possible not only to save your game, but write your own program at home. The dynamic, cutting-edge AI seen in The Phantom Pain was far from the era of tapes, however. It was so good at what Kojima Productions had programmed it to do, which is to change all on its own, that it actually hindered staging a demonstration. According to Kojima, quote, "The behavior of the enemy is different every time. I can't help it because I can't predict it. I found out while playing it's not possible to pre-plan a presentation," end quote. But what truly made the MGS5 sub-series of games revolutionary and part of a whole was their goal, in Kojima's words, to break taboos. Peace Walker made every boss a different Metal Gear, which violated series traditions. More importantly, the game held pacifistic values and was openly, for a Japanese game, accepting of non-traditional sexuality. Ground Zeroes, on the other hand, portrayed an extremely taboo topic, not violence itself, but the psychological consequences of it. Even more shockingly, the subject of this violence, which was sexual, were two children, characters that we knew and loved from Peace Walker named Chico and Paz. Child soldiers had been a major focus for MGS ever since Sons of Liberty, but with The Phantom Pain, these all-too-common real-world survivors and sufferers of war were depicted in-game for the first time. The Phantom Pain would deal with one intense and controversial subject after the next, drawing inspiration from Breaking Bad. These included everything from third world resource exploitation to ethnic cleansing to even the impact of McDonaldization on the globe, both in terms of body and mind. But one of the most crucial aspects of the Phantom Pain would be the game's dynamically nonlinear enemy AI, which I mentioned before. This attempted to resolve something inherent to every MGS before now. When you would hit an obstacle to your progress, chances were that you would stick to that same exact flawed tactic, continue after continue, until brute force won out. The Phantom Pain changes a little bit every time you hit continue, making it essential to mix up your approach in the face of failure. This was the game design equivalent of Kojima Productions teaching the player their philosophy that Kojima overviewed in 2009 at GDC of how to make the impossible possible, not only as game designers, but as human beings. In the Phantom Pain, it involved not clinging to the tried and true, but rather venturing open-eared and open-eyed into the unknown. It involved constant change and evolutionary growth. Evolution, not so coincidentally, would be a major subject for all three of the MGS5s. And yet another huge, arguably taboo change would be making most of the boss fights in the Phantom Pain optional.
Boss, you've got to lose him.
One uncanny aspect defining the Walkman trilogy was the way character models had to grow, from the Saturday morning cartoonishness offered by the PSP to the eerie photorealism of MGS5. Interpreting itself endlessly fed into MGS5's overall theme. The character Chico was literally reborn as an hombre nuevo by compositing together several real children's faces at once to get as close to the PSP's Chico as possible.
You're that photographer.
There's a sense in which the Walkman trilogy represents a borderline math psychology experiment.
Who knows? That's our reality here, whether it's real or not. If there's another truth, I don't want to know it.
Keep your headphones on at all times and pay attention.
I want Big Boss to hear his little diary. Hopefully, he's still a good listener.
Now do you remember who you are? What you were meant to do? I cheated death thanks to you. And thanks to you, I've left my mark. You have too. You've written your own history. You're your own man. I'm Big Boss. And you are too.
Peace Walker was aimed at a young adult audience that was sure to reach adulthood by the debut of Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain. This was a subversive betrayal of the player, and our stand-in, the revolutionary kid Chico, taking place across years and multiple releases, in a revolutionary experiment in generational game design. From its lowly origins on the MSX to the top of the industry as one of the most influential series of games in history, Metal Gear single-handedly made video games a better medium. The concept of digital fusion that began with MGS1 would define modern games as we know them in the early 21st century, as would MGS's one all-defining signature, evoking the player's will. The drama MGS taught us in a game has to serve the gameplay, and vice versa. It's all, ideally, part of one seamless hybrid. MGS, over time, integrated together not only movies and games, but also aspects of television, novels, radio dramas, and albums of original music. MGS was clearly important throughout all of its stages of technical evolution, and it's all paved the way for Hideo Kojima to finally spread his wings from Konami at Sony, where Death Stranding has just been completed. One aspect adding to the Phantom Pain's legend was the so-called Ruse Cruise, which referred to a trail of Easter eggs which seemed for many diehard fans to hint at an unreleased, still-to-come Chapter 3. What they may have missed was this was not only a biblical reference to the idea of the coming end of times, but a nod to the original PC-88 release of Snatcher, which had to leave the story on a cliffhanger due to hardware constraints. There's a quote by Kojima about this from 1993 that may shed some surprising light on the truth of whether or not the final MGS, the Phantom Pain, was truly, as so many have rumored it to be, released in an unfinished state. Quote, "Snatcher is now out of our hands as developers, and you could say it's walking on its own now. And our decision not to depict the rest is part of that. So there is no ending that we developers have to offer. We concluded this tale, but where the characters go from here is something we can only leave to you. We fleshed out their core roles, duties, and relationships. The rest is for you to develop." After completing the game, it's my hope that players will continue developing the drama and the world in their imaginations. I think that's the true interactivity of Snatcher. For me, it honestly feels like I'm saying farewell to new friends. On the one hand, I feel relieved, but I can't shake this hope that we'll meet again someday. The most common criticism we received was about Act 3. Many people complained, "I wish you would have given the player more freedom. Act 3 is like a digital comic." And that is certainly true. However, the story was so complex, and we had so much we wanted to convey to the players, that we took the chance of making it less interactive. The story required that we restrict the player's freedom to a certain degree, and I wanted to create a final scene, a tragic conclusion, where the player couldn't participate. Each character was beholden to a fate they could not change. I wanted Act 3 to let the player experience that anger and frustration. Act 1 and 2 are interactive scenarios, but Act 3 is different, a tragedy one cannot change. Fate. Perhaps it wasn't conveyed as well as I wanted. That's something for me to reflect on.
Not yet. It's not over yet.